So my name is Valentine, and I come here this morning to make you think. I got that from David Alexander the last time he spoke here. He said that anytime he goes to speak, he starts off with, basically saying why he's come here or why he's come there at that time. So I'm not a licensed practitioner, not a board member, but I proudly serve as one of the hundreds of members of the SLCA community, as do all of you. Give yourself a hand. And for about the past year and a half or so, I have had the privilege of serving on the member council at Centers for Spiritual Living. And I ran into David Aurelio a couple of weeks ago. It was actually on a Wednesday after Lori Palco's first Change Cycle Lunch and Learn. And I hadn't seen him in a couple of weeks, so he had a big smile on his face, as he usually does. And he told me that when he introduced the lineup of Sunday speakers for the month of June a couple of weeks prior, he introduced me as the father of SLCA when he noted that I was going to be speaking on Father's Day. And my first thought was, does Maury Povich still have that show? I said, maybe I need to call him up because I can see him now with the envelope. Lee Valentine. But here I am. And David Aurelio, he did recognize all of the fathers here today, the stepfathers, foster fathers. I would like to recognize a slightly different group, which will include all of those people as well. But will everyone here this morning who either has a father or had a father at one time in your life, even if that father was not a part of your life, would you please stand and be recognized? Okay, to all of you, I would like to say Happy Father's Day. And for those of you who are not standing, you may want to call Maury Povich because he might have a spot for you on his next show. So as most of you know, I like to weave humor into my talks, especially in the form of personal stories and anecdotes. And the challenge that I face is after speaking here for a few times, and this is my fourth time being in front of you, I start running out of those stories. So what I thought I would do this morning is to start off with a joke that I found online. And I made some slight modifications to that joke as a way of me welcoming our new spiritual director, Reverend David Alexander. So during one of his first meetings with the SLCA board, Reverend David found out that there was one of Atlanta's most successful lawyers who attended SLCA regularly, but this individual had never made a financial contribution to the center. Reverend David arranged a meeting with the lawyer to try to persuade him to contribute. After an initial introduction, he said, "Our research shows that out of a yearly income of at least $500,000, you have never made a financial contribution to SLCA. Wouldn't you like to give back to your spiritual community in some way?" The lawyer mulled this over for a moment and replied, "First, did your research also show that my mother is dying after a long illness and has medical bills that are several times her annual income?" Embarrassed, Reverend David responded, "No." The lawyer continued, "Or that my brother, a disabled veteran, is blind and confined to a wheelchair?" At this point, Reverend David began to stammer out an apology. The lawyer interrupted his apology saying, "Or that my sister's husband died in a traffic accident, leaving her penniless with 3 children?" Reverend David, completely beaten, said simply, "I had no idea." On a roll, the lawyer cut him off again and said, "So, if I didn't give any money to them, why should I give to SLCA?" So, Reverend David, when you watch the recording of this service, or if you happen to be watching this morning via Facebook Live, I say to you, welcome to your new spiritual home. So I'm not sure if it has anything to do with the fact I've lived here in Atlanta for over 25 years, but to put it mildly, I am not fond of driving in traffic. Actually, I think I would rather drive around in a circle for an hour than to be stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic for half that amount of time. And most of my extended family lives in Virginia, so I've made the drive along Interstate 85 between here and there more times than I can count over the years. And from Atlanta to the house in Virginia where I grew up and to where my parents lived until just a few years ago, it's about 8 hours door to door. And I typically make that drive straight through. Well, on one of those trips headed back to Atlanta, I was in the middle of North Carolina, somewhere around Greensboro, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was making pretty good time, so I was feeling pretty positive overall. But the next thing I know, I look up, and there's a convoy of DOT vehicles with their lights flashing. And the next thing I know, traffic comes to a stop, and they have blocked all 4 of the travel lanes on my side of the freeway. And they were inching along literally at about 2 miles per hour. And oddly enough, there was no visible construction activity. And the worst part at the time for me is I was the first person in line behind them. So the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm thinking to myself, if you had just been going a little faster, you would have been the last car through instead of the first car to be stopped. But this rolling road closure or traffic pacing, whatever it was, probably lasted about 10 or 15 minutes, which seemed like an eternity at the time. But eventually the crew accomplished whatever work it was they set out to do, and traffic was allowed to proceed. And since I was first in line, I hit the accelerator and sped up as quickly as I could. And what happened next was totally unexpected. Since traffic had been stopped behind me for almost 15 minutes, there was absolutely no one in front of me. So it was almost like I had the freeway to myself for about the next 20 miles, because the only cars that had entered the freeway in front of me were the handful of cars that had gotten on during that 20-minute stretch, which on a Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, were not very many. So if I had had the patience to be still or still my mind during that road closure, that traffic pacing, that patience would have paid off in the end. Or, as the title of my talk and the title of Penelope's song went, if I had just told myself to be still and know that everything would be all right, then it would have saved me that self-imposed anguish that I endured for those 10 or 15 minutes. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with the source of that saying. It comes from the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, chapter 46, verse 10, which says, in part, be still and know that I am God. Now, this passage must be taken in context to know its true biblical meaning, but it's not my intent this morning to examine it from that perspective. Rather, my goal is to examine the passage from the context, from the perspective of the teaching of Dr. Ernest Holmes and some other New Thought practitioners. So when we hear the phrase, be still and know, what exactly is it implying when it says be still? Is it trying to tell us to stop moving or to sit still or perhaps just stand still? Well, yes and no. In the context of the book of Psalms, it's telling the enemies of the people of God to stop fighting. And Christians often interpret the command to be still as to be quiet in God's presence. And I don't know about you, but I have a hard time being still at any time. And between the ages of 40 and 49, I threw myself an annual 40th birthday party at my house. And it got to be a rather popular event, and I would even have people reaching out to me, a couple of weeks before my birthday to make sure they hadn't missed their invitation. And one year, one of my Air Force buddies came in town for the party, and it was that Saturday morning. He was at my house sitting at the kitchen table on his laptop doing some work. And over the course of about 30 minutes, while I made some last-minute preparations, he probably watched me go up and down the stairs about 10 times, go in and out the house about 10 times onto the deck. And after a little while, he said to me, he said, dude, now I know why you're so skinny. He said, you never stop moving for more than 60 seconds. And for many of us, the same applies to our mind. It's always racing at about 100 miles an hour. Even if we sit down and try to relax, our mind continues to race. We're either thinking about what we're going to cook for dinner tonight, what we had for dinner last night, Did we remember to pick up the dry cleaning? When are we going to have time to do our reading for our next class at SLCA? And regardless of the topic, our mind is almost never truly still. And if we're honest about it, we have to admit that many of those thoughts racing through our mind are the kind of worries that will keep us up at night. Why can't I do anything right at work? Why doesn't she love me the way I love her? Why can't I get rid of these extra 20 pounds? And obviously that's not me. And when will I get my life together? Well, for those of us who have ever taken a meditation class, you've probably heard this referred to as monkey mind or mental chatter. And Elizabeth Gilbert, author of Eat, Pray, Love, described it this way. She said, I am burdened with what the Buddhists call the monkey mind, the thoughts that swing from limb to limb, stopping only to scratch themselves, spit, and howl. My mind swings wildly through time, touching on dozens of ideas a minute, unharnessed and undisciplined. But contrast this with other creatures in nature, both plants and animals. Can you imagine an oak tree standing tall and stately, thinking to itself, I wonder if the other trees will see me as weak if I'm the first one to lose my leaves this year? Or a blade of grass wet from the morning dew, thinking to itself, doesn't that blade of grass next to me realize she's blocking my sunlight? Who does she think she is? If she doesn't stop throwing me shade, I may have to go off on her. Or how about a cat stretching after a long nap in the sun, thinking to itself, okay, I wonder what piece of upholstered furniture I can destroy next. But I have to admit, as a former cat owner, that example is probably pretty accurate. Now, in his book entitled Stillness Speaks, Eckhart Tolle said, when walking or resting in nature, honor that realm by being fully there. Be still, look, listen. See how every animal and every plant is completely itself. Unlike humans, they have not split themselves in two. They do not live through mental images of themselves, so that they do not need to be concerned with trying to protect and enhance those images. The deer is itself. The daffodil is itself. He went on to say, the playfulness and joy of a dog, its unconditional love and readiness to celebrate life at any moment, often contrasts sharply with the inner state of a dog's owner. Depressed, anxious, burdened by problems, lost in thought, not present in the only place and time there is, here and now. One wonders, living with this person, how does the dog manage to remain so sane, so joyous? That reminds me of a bumper sticker I saw on the back of a car one time. It said, be the person your dog thinks you are. But for better or worse, mankind, supposedly that the higher species, we're the only one to subject ourselves to this self-imposed mental chatter and mental torture. So if we're to be still and know, the first step is to still our mind, and like anything else, it'll get easier over time. Many people use the spiritual practice of meditation as a way to help them still their mind and achieve a greater sense of mindfulness. And it's been said that when you pray, you talk, but when you meditate, you listen. And that's all well and good, but I'll stand here and tell you that being still and achieving a higher state of mindfulness is definitely not something that you can or should only do when you're meditating. It has just as much to do with being present in the here and now at this moment, as Tolle wrote. And Buddha put it this way. He said, the secret of health for both mind and body is not to mourn for the past, worry about the future, or anticipate troubles, but to live in the present moment wisely and earnestly. He went on to say, as you walk and eat and travel, be where you are. Otherwise, you will miss most of your life. A couple of years ago, I went for a walk on the Beltline after work one day, and there were quite a few people out, which is pretty typical for that time of day. And as I looked ahead of me, I noticed a young couple walking together. And I thought to myself how nice it was for them to be spending some quality time together. And I imagined that they had both probably put in a long day at work and might have had a long commute to and from their respective offices. And they were taking advantage of living close to the Beltline to get out and enjoy some time together in the fresh air. And I was walking at a pretty brisk pace, so as I got closer to them, I noticed something that made me rethink my assessment. I could see that each of them was talking on their phone while they walked side by side. So I suppose they were present at that moment, but just not with each other. And in the book by Eckhart Tolle that I just mentioned, the author says that stillness is actually inner peace, and the combination of these two are the essence of your being. But according to him, stillness is more than just the absence of noise and chatter or the calming of your monkey mind. He says it's intelligence itself, a dimension of consciousness deeper than thought, the underlying consciousness out of which every form is born, the very essence of you are, or the very essence of who you are. And he uses the example of the passage in the Bible where it says, God created the world and saw that it was good. That's what you see when you look from stillness without thought. Some call it Christ consciousness or Buddha nature, which is present within every one of us, not just these master teachers. And he even goes so far as to say that this inner stillness will save and transform the world. And try remembering that when the next time you're on a plane sitting next to a cranky child. You can turn to them and say, sweetheart, if you just channel your inner stillness right now, you might save and transform the world. Or at least my sanity for the duration of this flight. So how do we go about achieving that state of inner stillness? According to Tolle, the key is to be aware of awareness. And you may be thinking, okay, is this some sort of riddle? Well, not exactly, but let's examine it a little more closely. Our conscious mind is a powerful thing. Great thinkers like Albert Einstein and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used their mental capacity to further humanity. But our conscious mind is only a small part of the consciousness that we are. That voice in our head, whether we call it monkey mind or something else, is not us talking to ourselves. It is simply the ego feeding itself. So we must stop identifying with that voice and realize that we are not the one who is thinking those thoughts. Rather, we are the one who is aware of them. Knowing yourself as the awareness behind the voice, or becoming aware of awareness, can truly transform your life. So we've talked about the be still part of be still and know. How about the knowing part? During one of our past services, I took some notes about the process required to affect any change in our lives. And I think it was Reverend David who delivered that message, but I could be mistaken. So if I should attribute it to anyone here this morning, I apologize in advance for the oversight. But anyway, the speaker said that morning that there's a progression of steps that we must go through anytime we want to change some aspect of our lives. Those steps in order are hope, faith, trust, belief, and knowing. And you've probably heard some variation of this sequence before. So as an example, if my relationship with one of my family members is strained and I want to resolve the issues between us, then the first thing I must do is have hope that the relationship can be healed. Without that, then there's literally no hope of the change taking place. And with each step along the progression, from hope to faith to trust to belief and knowing, we increase our level of confidence in the total certainty of the change, as well as our acceptance of the change. So for example, if we only hope that something is true, that implies we don't yet have faith that it's true, and we certainly don't believe that it's true. And we can look at it from the concept of spiritual mind treatment or affirmative prayer, which is one of the core spiritual practices within New Thought. Can you imagine a practitioner standing before you on a Sunday morning, beginning his or her treatment with these words? Let us take a few deep breaths as we center ourselves in this moment. I hope that God is the source of all, the unlimited power and creative intelligence that is hopefully all present. Or how about, I'm going to recite these words in first person, but I encourage you to take them as your own. I truly believe the infinite source that I call God acts through me, as me, and in me, as I really believe it does with all of life. So you obviously see how hard it would be for us to fathom affirming something in prayer by stating anything short of, this I know for sure. In Science of Mind, we say that God is omnipresent or everywhere present. Other faiths might say that God is omniscient to indicate God is all-knowing. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there's probably no faith out there that says that God is all-hoping or all-trusting. I mean, come on. Even Santa Claus knows who's been naughty or nice. Right? But let's talk a bit more about what it means to know something. In his book, Conversations with God, Neil Donald Walsh is told by God that all physical life functions in accordance with a set of natural laws. They're perfect laws creating perfect function for the physical universe. And when the author asks what he needs to do to learn these laws, God responds by saying, "It is not a question of learning, but of remembering. How can I remember them?" In the book, God says to the author, "The soul, your soul, knows all there is to know all the time. There is nothing hidden to it, nothing unknown." Think about that. Your soul knows all there is to know all the time. Now, there have been documented studies over the years with individuals demonstrating knowledge of things under hypnosis that they never would have otherwise claimed to know. And one of those studies that I found online is entitled "The Retrieval of Lost Language Abilities Using Hypnotic Age Regression." In one part of the study, when the researcher hypnotized a 26-year-old Japanese American back to the age of 3, he spoke in Japanese. But when taken out of hypnosis, the subject was adamant that he had never learned the Japanese language. And when the researcher played the tape recording of the sessions for a native speaker of Japanese without telling him the subject was under hypnosis, he said, "He seems to be an adult around 20 to 30 years of age, although generally speaking, his utterances are childish, like those 3 to 5-year-old children might use." And the subject himself said of the experience when encouraged to recall it, "It was like my lips all of a sudden would move into these funny shapes. And then I would want to say something and I wouldn't know what I was really saying. The words just came out and I wasn't sure whether they were real or not. The strangest thing is that my muscles would just take over without my volition. It was really like my mind wasn't involved in it." In another unrelated study, a British woman was distressed by a recurring dream in which she, as a child and another child, fell from a high gallery in their home while playing to their deaths. And she vividly remembered the black and white checked marble floor on which they died. And she repeated the dream to several of her friends. And sometime later, the woman was visiting an old house that had a reputation for being haunted. And with its black and white marble floor, the woman immediately recognized it as the scene of the deaths in her dream. She subsequently learned that a small brother and sister really had fallen to their deaths in the house. Now, I won't stand here this morning and try to assure you of the authenticity of these stories, but what I will say is they're very intriguing. Could it be that there really is a part of us, whether we call it our subconscious, our soul, or some other term, that does know all there is to know all the time? Perhaps the only thing we lack is the ability to tap into that wealth of knowledge. Perhaps we just haven't evolved to the level of awareness or consciousness to be able to call forth all that we really know, or at least not yet. So we've talked about the be still part and the know part, but how about the last part of the passage from the book of Psalms? Be still and know that I am God. Well, I have a confession to make. Earlier, when I walked you through the progression of steps that we have to go through when we want to affect any change in our lives, I left one out. I said those steps in order are hope, faith, trust, belief, and knowing. Well, there's a final step that represents the true achievement of any change, and that is being. Gandhi didn't say, hope for the change you want to see in the world, or have faith in the change you want to see in the world. He said, be the change you want to see in the world. So going back to the example of the strained relationship with a family member, if I really want to heal that relationship, then I start with hoping that it can change for the better. Then I have faith that it can change. Then I trust in the healing. Over time, I believe it can be changed until I know that it is indeed the case. But ultimately, for the change to truly take place, I have to live it. I have to be it. As you might imagine, of all the steps on that progression, the last one is truly the most difficult, or at least for us mere mortals. It's not hard for the tree to be the best tree it can be, and it comes quite naturally for the cat to be the best cat it knows how to be, even when that means picking out the next chair arm to scratch on. But us humans, a higher evolved species, we create mental images of ourselves, and we go through life trying to project and protect those images as a way of feeding our ego. And I was in a gift shop a little while ago, and I ran across a magnet that said, I wish everyone would just accept me for the person I pretend to be. And American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley had an interesting take on this. He said that individuals develop their concept of self by observing how they are perceived by others, a concept he called the looking glass self. Now, the looking glass self describes a process where individuals base their self-concept on how they believe others view them. He said, I am not what I think I am, and I am not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am. I know that sounds like something straight out of a Dr. Seuss book, so let me repeat it. It says, I am not what I think I am, and I am not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am. So imagine you're walking down the sidewalk. You're feeling pretty confident because you got on a new outfit. You've been working out, so you feel pretty good about yourself. And as you continue down the street, everyone you pass by stops to stare at you. At first, you don't pay much attention, but then after it happens several times, you're thinking to yourself, is there like lipstick on my forehead, or did I, forget to zip up my pants, or did I forget to comb my hair this morning? At that point, you're no longer the person you thought you were, confident and self-assured, and you're not the person other people think you are because you can't read their minds. You don't really know what they're thinking. No, you are the person you think they think you are. And here's a story that illustrates this point. One day, 2 frogs fell into a deep pit and were unable to get out. Several other frogs gathered around to witness the plight of the 2 that had fallen in. Both of the frogs were trying to get out of the pit by jumping as high and as hard as they could. All the other frogs that had gathered around the hole started shouting loudly and advising against the foolish act, as jumping out of the pit seemed impossible. But both of the frogs still went on frantically trying to escape by jumping out. However, all the other frogs kept shouting from their perch high above that there was no way they could escape. One of the frogs heeded the advice of the group of frogs on the rim and stopped trying to jump out. The other frog, however, continued to jump. With each try, he got closer and closer to the top of the hole, even as the frogs high above him shouted for him to give up. And eventually, in one huge leap, the frog made it out of the pit, to the astonishment of all the other frogs. Well, it turned out that the frog that made it out of the pit was actually deaf. He mistook the muffled shouts of the other group of frogs to be cheering for his efforts and encouragement to try even harder. So in that case, both of the frogs were truly being who they thought the other frogs thought they were. And at the end of the day, figuratively and sometimes literally, we'll make a conscious decision to be still and know. But what exactly is it that we're going to know? Well, here's the most wonderful part of our teaching. We're going to be still and know that God is the one presence and power in the universe. We're going to be still and know that God is the source of all, and God is all there is. We're going to be still and know that we are one with God. We're going to be still and know that everything and everyone in the universe is made of the God substance and is a unique, individualized expression of God. We're going to be still and know that we are a divine idea in the mind of God. We're going to be still and know that through our conscious awareness, we can manifest the divinity of God in our everyday existence. And in keeping with this month's theme of divine mastery, we're going to be still and know that we are masters of our own divinity. And even better, we're going to be still and be masters of our own divinity. As our founder, Dr. Ernest Holmes, wrote, there should always be a recognition and treatment of the absolute unity of God and man, the oneness, inseparability, changelessness, God as the big circle and man as the little circle. Man is in God and God is in man, just as a drop of water is in the ocean while the ocean is in the drop of water. This is a recognition that the master teacher Jesus had when he said, I and my Father are one. When you see me, you see the Father. So to each of you again, I say, Happy Father's Day. Thank you.